Day one of SEC football media days in the books. So, what did the Tigers have to say? We're talking about all of it on Locked on LSU. Let's get it.
You are Locked on LSU, your daily podcast on the LSU Tigers. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Okay, let's get it. It is Locked on LSU, your team every day. I'm your host, Matt Moscona. Glad to have you aboard with us here. Thank you for making us your first listen every single day. We are free, available wherever you get great podcasts, of course, on YouTube as well. So please subscribe. If you're on YouTube, smash that like button, hit the bell to be notified whenever we post a new video. Today's episode brought to you by Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, use the code LOCKEDONCollege for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. So from some disclosure here as we push off from the dock. It is 11:25 p.m. Central Time. I have been efforting for the last 2 hours fighting with Wi-Fi in the Dallas Omni Hotel, trying to get this episode off the ground. And what I ultimately came to the conclusion is that none of the video elements I planned on using on this show are going to be able to be used. And so for those of you listening on podcasts, you're not going to get that audio. You're just going to have me talking for this episode. And for some of you, that's okay. For others, that might not be great. And I sincerely apologize. But technology, we can't live with it, and we can't do podcasts without it. So we're just having sincere issues in the Dallas Omni with all the Wi-Fi connectivity, and I'm just unable to use any of the video. But I hope that I can do an adequate job today relating what happened today, because I did have an opportunity to have one-on-one interviews with Brian Kelly, Garrett Nussmeier, Harold Perkins, and Mason Taylor, and also spoke today with William Schmidt. So we will get to all of that. Day two of the Major League Baseball draft is in the books, and I have to talk about what this means for LSU baseball, so we'll get to that a bit later. I did have my one-on-one with William Schmidt. I'll tell you sort of what he told me about why he made the decision to go to school at LSU instead of jumping into the MLB draft. And then I do want to relate some of what the LSU players said to me during our one-on-ones. But let me start with Brian Kelly, and I want to set up kind of how the day went. So Greg Sankey opened the day at 9:05 a.m. Central Time. And then after Greg Sankey was Brian Kelly. So before Brian Kelly went into the main room at 10 o'clock, there was a scrum of about 15 or so at media members on the LSU beat. And Brian Kelly sat at a table with about the 15 of us circled around him, asking questions just like you would in a post-game session. And then when Brian Kelly was finished, he walked out of the room. The players walked in, and they had 3 different breakout areas where you can go up and have a conversation with them. And just very candidly, I knew I was going to get each of those players on Radio Row. So I didn't go run up to any of them. And while I was kind of hanging in the back, Brian Kelly walked right up to me and said, "Okay, Matt, what do you want to know?" And so he and I chatted for about 5 or 6 minutes on the record, and a couple of things that I thought were newsy that are worth relaying. Because much of what Brian Kelly covered in the media scrum is everything you would kind of expect. Needing to improve the defense, why he's had success in year 3. It's worth mentioning, year 3 at Notre Dame was when Brian Kelly had the undefeated season, and they played Alabama for a championship. Year 3 at Cincinnati, they were an 11-win team and played in the Orange Bowl. Year 3 at Central Michigan is kind of when he finally broke through. He took over a very bad program and broke through in year 3 with, I believe, a 9-win season. So year 3 for Brian Kelly has been when he's seen that parabolic raise. And sort of what his explanation was that you get real legitimate buy-in by year 3. So his expectation of his players and coaches all dramatically ramps up. And I would expect the same this year for Brian Kelly and these LSU Tigers. But outside of the common things that we would expect, there were 2 questions I really wanted to ask Brian Kelly that were sort of newsy. And one of them was about cornerback Zy Alexander. So if you remember, Zy Alexander tore his ACL on the final play of the first half of the Army game in November. And we did not see Zy Alexander in spring. And what Brian Kelly told me is that Alexander is currently at about 90% flexion. So basically his ability to bend his knee is at about 90%. And that's fantastic news. And he said they do expect that he'll be cleared for fall camp. And so they're expecting Zy Alexander to be able to go through fall camp and to be ready for the season. Now, I personally think that is massively significant because even though you weren't good in the secondary a year ago, Zy Alexander was by far the best defensive back you had. If you were here on an episode over the weekend, I believe it was Saturday's bonus coverage, when we talked about Jace Thomas on his commitment day, I mentioned Zy Alexander and his statistics compared to every other cornerback on the roster a year ago, where Zy Alexander had 2 picks and 7 pass breakups. No other cornerback had more than 2 PBUs a year ago. So even though he missed the final month of the season, Zy Alexander was still by far your most productive cornerback. So if he's healthy, I think that's a big boost because in theory, you have one cornerback slot locked down. And you're now just wondering, okay, will one of the Ohio State transfers or maybe a freshman like PJ Woodland or one of the rising sophomores like Stamps or Toviano take that spot? But the other thing that was so interesting when I was talking to Brian Kelly about the corners outside of Zy Alexander is he mentioned they have 18 scholarship defensive backs and how his charge to his staff in spring was not looking for a pecking order. He was not looking for who's going to be the starter, who's the ones in the twos. It was, let's find out what they can do. It's not let's find a pecking order. It's go test them in a lot of different spots and let's find out what they can do. For example, they wanted to take some weight off of Javen Toviano. That was a point of emphasis for Brian Kelly mentioned in the spring. They're still not sure if Sage Ryan is going to play corner or safety. And I thought that was interesting because we saw Sage Ryan work almost exclusively at safety in the spring. But apparently that's not a 100% done deal. If they maybe don't get the answers they want at corner, perhaps Sage Ryan moves back to corner. So some of that I found very interesting. PJ Woodland, they wanted to have him add some weight, the true freshman early enrollee. So the defensive back spot's still very, very much undefined at this point, but it was interesting that they are expecting to have Zy Alexander ready for fall camp. The other newsy bit from Brian Kelly in my conversation with him was about Trey Holly, and I did tweet this news for those that might have seen it. So Trey Holly, you might remember, of course, was the freshman a year ago, Louisiana's all-time leading rusher in high school, and he was involved in a shooting situation, accused in a shooting situation in his hometown, and faced some charges. The more serious charges have been wiped away, but other charges still linger, and the legal proceedings have really drawn out. As a matter of fact, I remember asking Brian Kelly at media availability near the end of spring for an update, and he thought that just within a couple of weeks, the Trey Holly situation would be resolved. It wasn't. And the most recent development is that J.R. Belton, who's a member of LSU staff, his father is actually the judge assigned to that case. And so Judge Belton had to recuse himself from the case because of JR's affiliation with the LSU football program. And so a new judge was assigned and things got delayed. But what Brian Kelly told me is that that case is expected to be adjudicated next week. And so they are hopeful that within a couple of weeks here, the Trey Holly situation will be completely rectified and the running back will be able to join LSU. He has been working out, not with the team, but the team has given him his workout protocols, his workout training regimen, and he has been able also to stay in school. So he has been able to keep up academically, so there wouldn't be any type of academic suspension or anything of the sort. So this is drawn out, I think, much longer than anybody thought. Legal proceedings often do. In many cases, legal proceedings don't really care about college football. In some cases, maybe they do. But the good news for LSU is that it appears that Trey Holly is going to be available for the LSU Tigers this season. And when you look at that running game, you are replacing 1,100 yards from Jaden Daniels. So how do you do that? Well, you're going to do that through the running game anyway, with running backs. So yes, having Trey Holly would be very significant for LSU, should they in fact be able to get him back here for the start of fall camp and for the start of the season. All right. That's the high points of my conversation with Brian Kelly. As I mentioned, though, I had a chance to talk to Garrett Nussmeier, Harold Perkins, and Mason Taylor. I'd like to share some of the the particulars about my conversations with LSU's 3 players that attended media days. We'll get to that as we continue here on Locked on LSU, your team every day. Passion, drive, and patience. The formula for winning championships is also what keeps your ride or die alive. eBay Motors has everything you need to maintain your vehicle and to level it up to peak performance. That's right. Today's episode brought to you by eBay Motors, great partners of ours here on Locked on LSU. Whether you're into speed, power, style, eBay Motors has you covered with over 122 million parts for your number one ride or die. You'll always find exactly what you're looking for. And with eBay Guaranteed Fit, your part is guaranteed to fit your ride every time or your money back, because with eBay Motors, you're burning rubber, not cash. With all the parts you need at the prices you want, it's easy to make your car the MVP and bring home huge wins. Keep your ride or die alive at ebaymotors.com. Eligible items only. Exclusions apply. eBay Guaranteed Fit only available to U.S. customers. That's eBay Motors, proud partners here of Locked on LSU. So I had a conversation with Brian Kelly, but also had conversations with each of LSU's 3 players that attended SEC football media days. And I'll kind of go in order of maybe what I think might be your interest level, with Garrett Nussmeier, Harold Perkins, and then Mason Taylor. For Garrett Nussmeier, Brian Kelly probably had the best analogy. He compared Garrett Nussmeier to renting or owning a car. Essentially saying, when you rent a car, you may not take the best care of it. Maybe you might get a ding on it. Maybe you eat food in it. Maybe leave trash in it. Not to say that's everybody, but there's a different standard of care when it's yours. And that would be kind of where Garrett Nussmeier is, according to Brian Kelly. And maybe the biggest thing that stood out was, understanding for Garrett Nussmeier, he waited his turn, and this is his shot, and he is taking ownership not only of the offense, but of this team. And so he has been the guy who's organized the player-led practices, or the player-run practices, PRPs, as they call them. And when somebody's loafing or lagging or not doing what they're supposed to be doing, it's Garrett Nussmeier that's getting on them, because he realizes this is his opportunity. And I did ask Garrett specifically about his decision to stay at LSU. And he conceded that there were times where he considered leaving, and it would be only natural to do so. Now, he said he never got close ever to actually formally submitting his name in the portal or anything of the sort, but it was something that entered his mind naturally, but then he quickly replaced it. He talked very openly about his faith and being led by faith to be the quarterback at LSU, and this being the place that he wanted to be and wanted to represent. And I think he's also had an amazing example by which to watch in Jayden Daniels. Now, Jayden Daniels transferred, but he was also a very patient player who ended up playing 5 seasons of college football, and look how it paid off. Now, specifically on the field, I think, for Garrett Nussmeier, I asked him if being the son of a coach was maybe a benefit for him, or how might it be a benefit. And he shared an interesting story about how when they were at Alabama a couple of years ago, he looked in one corner of the end zone and could remember being 12 years old when his dad was an assistant at Alabama and playing catch in that end zone. And the point he was relaying was that everything is familiar to him. Nothing is unfamiliar. Maybe that's the advantage he has. It doesn't make you a great player, but for some student athletes who may struggle with the transition into the college game and the large crowds and all the expectation and the media and everything around, that's something that's very familiar and very comfortable for Garrett Nussmeier, because he's been around it really his whole life as the son of a coach. I think that poise, coupled with his physical ability, gives him a pretty rare combination that should make him be able to transition into this offense as the guy even easier. Now, Harold Perkins, on the other hand, I think is one of the more fascinating test cases, not only in the SEC or for LSU, but in all of college football. And I don't mean for that to be hyperbolic, but when you think about Harold Perkins specifically, this is a guy that's an All-American. This is a guy that was a freshman All-American and exploded onto the scene 2 years ago. And everyone expects to be this dynamic edge rusher and is in everybody's first round as a first round draft pick, everybody's mock draft. Well, Brian Kelly, talked about Perk and moving him to off-ball linebacker again. And what was interesting is Brian Kelly actually kind of turned it on Harold because, while Brian Kelly was asked why you would move this player that's this great edge rusher and has this superpower, why you would move him to a new position, Brian Kelly actually said, well, it's really on Harold because you can't play, as he put it, you can't play inside linebacker in the SEC at 210 pounds. You got to get bigger. So will Harold Perkins commit himself to getting bigger and being physically ready to be a 3-down linebacker? Keep in mind, tried this a year ago. Harold Perkins had the great freshman season as a situational rusher. Going into his sophomore year, he wanted to be an off-ball linebacker. They spent all offseason working with him to be an inside backer. And after one game against Florida State, it was pretty clear that wasn't going to fly. And so they moved him into that nickel Sam role. Well, Harold Perkins told us today that, when he showed up on campus, he was 210. Last year, he played at 217. Now he's 225. Says he still feels fast and explosive and doesn't feel like he needs to get any bigger. So we'll see if his current size is going to be enough to maintain the rigors of playing on the inside in the SEC. I know we've talked plenty about Blake Baker's feelings on Harold Perkins moving and that he's athletically gifted enough to be an off-ball linebacker in the SEC. Only time will tell if that will work. But for now, what we have seen is Harold Perkins commit himself and his body to being that guy. And when I asked Harold Perkins specifically why he wanted to be an inside linebacker, and I asked him that very pointedly, especially after hearing Brian Kelly's comments, his response was not necessarily that he wanted to be an inside linebacker. It was that he wanted to do whatever the team needed best to help them win. Now, something doesn't exactly jive there. I'm not calling Harold Perkins a liar or Brian Kelly a liar. I'm just saying somebody's story here doesn't jive. When Brian Kelly is talking about it's on Harold to learn this sort of stuff and get his body ready, and the Harold Perkins is saying he doesn't necessarily want to be an off-ball linebacker. He just wants to do whatever's best to help the team win. Well, I don't know that Harold Perkins being an off-ball linebacker is what's best to help this team win. It may be. I mean, he may very well go out there in the opener against SC, have 15 tackles, 2 sacks, 3 TFLs, and we all look and go, Eureka, they figured it out. But there is very much a concept or a situation there or an idea of I need to see it to believe it. So for Harold Perkins, he's got a giant question mark because he's trying to do something, again, that he was unable to do a year ago. And for this LSU defense, which is trying to get dramatically better than it was a year ago, you need your best player, who is Harold Perkins, to play really well. You need him to be an impact guy. You can't afford to have Harold Perkins be a stat collector in a bad defense because you don't have him in key moments. And maybe the best place for Harold Perkins is going to be back in that nickel Sam role. And maybe Greg Penn and Whitweeks and Westweeks are going to be your best options at inside linebacker. Or maybe Harold Perkins does what Damone Clark did in 2021, which is have a massive blow-up season and become a first-team all-conference player and an All-American candidate. So we know Perkins is athletic and can rush the passer. The question is, can he do all the other things you need to do to be a 3-down linebacker? If he can, in many respects, that solves the middle of your defense. So it's a big if, but we'll start to get those answers as soon as LSU tees it up and kicks it off against USC coming up on September the 1st. And as for Mason Taylor, maybe the most interesting part about the convo with Mason Taylor is Brian Kelly referred to Mason Taylor as an NFL tight end. And when Mason Taylor signed with LSU, he was 230 pounds. He's now 6'6", 255 is what he told me on Monday at SEC Football Media Days. He has grown into his body. He is healthy, had a shoulder injury as a freshman, an ankle injury as a sophomore. If Mason Taylor can, in fact, stay healthy, I do think that Mason Taylor is probably the guy who stands to gain the most statistically by Jaden Daniels' absence. Remember, Jaden Daniels ran for 1,100 yards. There's no running back on this LSU team that's going to get the amount of attempts to make up that rushing yardage. Maybe we see Caleb Jackson have a great season. It's just hard to believe that you're going to see that. So what you're probably going to see is LSU make up for those rushing yards from Jaden Daniels in the short and intermediate passing game, sort of as an extension of the run. And the tight end would go a long way to, to elevating that part of the game. Mason Taylor had over 400 yards receiving as a freshman, just under 400 yards as a sophomore. So, and again, injured with the ankle. Can Mason Taylor challenge Thad Moss's single season receiving record for a tight end at LSU? I think there's a good chance that he can, because not only are you replacing the rushing attempts and rushing yardage from Jaden Daniels, you're also replacing all the targets and catches from Malik Neighbors and Brian Thomas. So it's got to go somewhere. And the fact that Brian Kelly brought Mason Taylor to SEC Media Days, I think speaks volumes about what the expectation is. And when Brian Kelly was asked about it, he said, listen, everybody knows who Will Campbell is, but Mason Taylor has been overshadowed in this offense the last 2 years because you've had Jaden Daniels and Brian Thomas and Malik Neighbors and some fantastic football players, and Mason Taylor just hasn't been talked about enough. But they feel like he is an integral part of what they want to do offensively and wanted to give Mason Taylor this stage at SEC Media Days. He'll have plenty of opportunities as well against SC in an LSU's 12-game schedule, because Brian Kelly leans on his tight ends in this offense. And Mason Taylor is going to have a massive opportunity to have the best pass-catching season for a tight end in LSU football history. But we'll start to get those answers when they actually start to play games. A busy day here at SEC Football Media Days, day one with LSU at the podium. But it was also day two of the MLB Draft. And boy, did we start to get some clarity of what LSU's baseball roster for 2025 is going to look like. I'll get to that here in just a smidge on Locked on LSU, your team every day. Thank you for making us your first listen every day here on Locked on LSU. Might I suggest my buddy Chris Gordy over at Locked on SEC for your second listen. Of course, Chris is down at Radio Row and has the entire league covered here at SEC Football Media Day. So if you want to get all the ins and outs from the conference, make your second listen Locked on SEC. I will briefly step away from SEC Football Media Days to recap what happened in day two of the draft. By the way, I did have a chance on my radio show on Monday to visit with William Schmidt. You can catch that interview if you'd like. You can check out After Further Review on demand on YouTube or on your favorite podcast app. I wanted to share some snippets of that interview with you here. But again, as I mentioned, we're just having some real issues with video here. So I apologize for that. But essentially what William Schmidt said was that he made his decision on Sunday, his final decision. To come to LSU's campus and to bypass the draft. Said he sure hopes that he gets a natty and plays 3 years at LSU and increases his draft stock. Also did acknowledge that the fact that this all happened very quickly for him, going from a guy that was thought to be maybe a 4th, 5th round pick at the start of his senior year to a guy that was very squarely in round one over the span of 5 months, really didn't give him time to process all that had happened to him so quickly, but it's to LSU's great benefit. Now, let me quickly run through what happened in the draft in day two and then kind of summarize what all this means, okay? So the first player off the board with LSU ties on Monday was Thatcher Hurd. He went in round 3, 89th overall to the Yankees. That was a nice spot for Thatcher Hurd to go to be in the Yankees organization. We saw Cale Fountain and an LSU signee, the infielder, come off the board. He's a third baseman with really good power, right-handed bat. He went to the Padres in round 5. So Cale Fountain, we talked about some of the infielders, how LSU had a handful of them in this high school signing class. Cale Fountain off the board, will not be coming to campus. The Yankees selected another LSU pitcher in round 6, and that was Griffin Herring. So in the final week leading up to the draft, we've talked about it plenty here, but a lot of the feeling was that the Herring-Bear Jones dynamic had flipped. That Herring, who had been starting in the Cape, had started to use his changeup. A lot of scouts had seen it. Was that Griffin Herring was ultimately going to sign and not come back to school. And that Bear Jones had kind of maybe seen his stock slip in around round 7 or so, and that he was actually planning on coming back to campus. And true to form, Herring taken in round 6. We'll see what they offered him. I think that number is going to be interesting because it's probably an oversign. I'd imagine that Griffin Herring is going to get in the neighborhood of $500,000, $600K. But we'll see what the number is ultimately when he does sign that contract. But Griffin Herring, done at LSU after 2 seasons. He'll be in the Yankees organization. As expected, Fidel Ulloa comes off the board. He was in round 7 to the Colorado Rockies. Again, if you go in the top 10 rounds, you are going to sign. You have already agreed to terms when a team called you to draft you. Ulloa just 1 year in Baton Rouge, 96, 97 power arm from the right side. Ulloa drafted and gone. The next player to be drafted is one that we kind of, if you were here on Monday's episode, we alluded to this possibly happening. So Luke Hayden, the pitcher from Indiana State, was taken in the 8th round by the Cincinnati Reds, which means he will not show up at LSU. And then Nate Ackenhausen went to the Royals in round 10. That's very much a senior sign there, where sometimes you see this, guys that don't have any leverage go in those top 10 rounds because they'll be able to be signed for less than slot value. So these teams could take that money and use it for someone else. Cole Freeman was a guest on my radio show several weeks back, and he shared his own story, going from being, an 18th round pick or so where he was offered $300K to sign, comes back, goes in round 4 and gets half that number. So Ackenhausen, a senior sign, not going to get whatever the slot value is for that pick at 287, but is going to the Royals and now the chance, to catch on with a big league team. So we'll see with that number as well. The name I omitted, obviously, is Bear Jones. And so the 2 interesting things here are Luke Hayden and then Bear Jones, and then what else comes after this. So I want to remind you again. So when William Schmidt made the announcement that he was coming to LSU's campus, one of the things we talked about on Monday's episode is you're probably going to see either Luke Hayden drafted and sign, or you're going to see one of those transfers ask for their release and go to another school. It's not to say that they don't want to pitch at LSU or don't want to compete or anything like that. But when you have a short window to make the most of it, you have to go somewhere where you are going to get innings. And if you're Luke Hayden, remember, LSU signed 8 right-handed pitchers out of the portal. You're Luke Hayden. You were a draftable prospect, and he made the decision ultimately to sign. Might have been encouraged to sign because with William Schmidt showing up on campus, that's another right-handed arm that's going to take innings and opportunities away from someone else. And in this instance, it looks like that was Luke Hayden. So Luke Hayden is going to sign after being taken there on day 2 of the MLB Draft with William Schmidt coming to campus. Now, with Bear Jones going undrafted, I want to be clear again, that's not to say Jones's phone didn't ring. Most certainly it did. But whatever his number was, clearly he didn't get it, so teams passed on him. I still believe someone is going to draft Bear Jones on day 3. They'll draft him, see if he has a change of heart. Maybe you can manipulate some money and they can get him to sign. That's one we'll continue to watch. But with Bear Jones very likely coming back to campus, that is a massive win for Jay Johnson. William Schmidt coming to campus, Kate Arambidi making it to campus along with Derek Curiel, and then Bear Jones as well. And his 28 home runs is a massive, massive development for LSU here. And what that may mean, however, is when you look at Dalton Beck, Eddie Yaman, Luis Hernandez, those 3 players right there, all first base DH guys like Bear Jones, one of those guys very likely, and again, I want to be clear, I'm not breaking news, I'm not reporting anything here. I'm just looking at history and circumstance and playing numbers. All 3 of those guys were brought here to compete for the first base and DH roles, with everyone thinking Jones and Travinsky were going to be gone. Well, if Jones is back, he's your first baseman. So now you really only have the DH role open, and all 3 of those guys aren't going to stay and try to compete for that job. I couldn't imagine all 3 staying trying to compete for that job. So don't be surprised if you have more attrition. But I want to be clear, that's a great problem to have. You 100% would rather have William Schmidt and Bear Jones on your team than any of the transfers that they've added. Proven talent and power in Bear Jones, massive, massive upside and ceiling in William Schmidt. I mean, he's a future Friday night guy in the SEC, and you have him for 3 years. So Absolutely. If you ask me, would you rather William Schmidt or Luke Hayden? Give me William Schmidt. If you ask me, would I prefer Bear Jones or one of the other transfers? Give me Bear Jones. The roster is far from being finished. We'll have to see how day 3 of the draft plays out. But it's hard to imagine Jay Johnson being anything other than thrilled having William Schmidt, and now it seems like very likely Bear Jones back for another year at LSU. Okay, that's going to do it for us here on this Tuesday edition of Locked on LSU. Again, my apologies for everybody on YouTube and then those of you on the audio side as well. I worked really hard to accumulate a lot of great interviews and audio and video for you today. And the Omni Wi-Fi here at Dallas, not a great situation. So my apologies for not being able to get you more of the video that I was hoping to bring you today. If we're able to rectify that, I'll bring you some of the clips on tomorrow's episode. So do me a solid. Whatever podcast app you're listening on, please subscribe, rate us, leave a review. If you're on YouTube, please smash that like button, subscribe to the YouTube channel, hit the bell so you're notified whenever a new video goes live, and tell a friend if they love the Tigers. We got you here every single weekday for Locked on LSU, not just every weekday, every day for Locked on LSU, your team every day.